Hello, listeners. This is Kat. Welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfic. This will be the continuation of All For You. This will be part 21, day 39. Izuku kept forgetting to breathe. He was desatting too much. He was having too many Brady spells. Izuku was intubated again. He was back on the ventilator. If he had been off it for just one more day, he would have been free of the ventilator for 2 weeks. He hated the sound of it. He hated the look of that familiar monitor. He hated the sight of the tube back in Izuku's mouth. He hated the sedation Izuku had to be under for the damn thing to work. He hated this. He hated this place. He hated everyone here. He hated how useless he was. He hated himself. Hisashi knew it was possible to be this stressed. He'd driven his enemies to it. He'd driven allies to it. He'd driven tools to it. But he never thought he'd be driven to it. It had only been 2 days since Izuku's diagnosis, and he could not do anything. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. He couldn't leave Izuku's side. The shakes came in waves. He had stopped using the steady hand squirk. It was pointless when they always broke through anyway. He could barely think. He was on the verge of being physically ill at every moment. He wanted to talk to Inko desperately, but knew that if he tried to call her number, he would shatter. There was no one to pick up the pieces. There was no one who could possibly want to pick up the pieces. He had to keep it together. For Izuku. Izuku, his precious sunshine, who was so strong and had made it through so much already, and surely he could make it through this too. Izuku, his tiny little being. It was so tiny and fragile and weak. How could he possibly fight this? He was going to die. Izuku, his heart, his world, his everything, who he was still humming lullabies to, in the vain, desperate hope it would somehow help. There was nothing else he could do. Nothing he can do. Nothing he can do. Nothing he can do. Hisashi had never been a religious man. Why would he be, when he could just become God himself? But this place, this nondescript children's hospital near Tokyo, had done more to humble him than he thought possible. He was just a man that could do nothing to save the child he loved with all the heart he didn't think he had. He'd heard that the walls of the hospitals heard more prayers than those of temples. Hisashi sent out one for any god that would listen to the pleas of a monster. Kami, Buddha, the Abrahamic god, anyone. He didn't care. His son didn't deserve this. He knew he did, but his son didn't deserve this. He'd do anything. Anything at all. Ring, 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 ring. Hello. This is Midoriya. I'm sorry I missed your call. Please leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Beep. Please, Inko. Please help him. Yoichi, too, if you're there. I can't. He's... A shaky breath. Call ended. The sound of the monitors didn't change. Izuku looked the same. Hisashi let out a sigh and rubbed his tired eyes. He didn't know if he had been heard, or if anyone had deigned to listen, or if there was anyone even there. All he could do now was hope. The antibiotics are not being as effective as we had hoped, Reiki-san said. Hisashi swallowed hard, pushing down the ever-constant nausea as best he could. He looked up at her, searching her stern face for any sign of hope. He didn't see any. Didn't you say NEC could be treated with antibiotics? Why aren't they working? Hisashi asked, wringing his hands. It can. In stage 1. It looks like he's progressing past that, Reiki-san said. It's barely been 2 days since he was diagnosed. NEC is a disease that moves fast, Midoriya-san, Reiki-san said softly. For him to survive, we may need to remove the disease part of his intestine. Hisashi felt like his body had been abandoned in the Arctic Circle. He felt like his insides had liquefied into a sludge that would burn him from the inside until there was nothing left. He needs more surgery, Hisashi heard himself ask. Yes, most likely, Reiki-san said. Someone let out a soft, slightly hysterical laugh. It took Hisashi a moment to recognize that it was him. The sludge was crawling up his throat. He swallowed it back and stood up on weak legs and said, Okay, then rushed to the bathroom. He fell before the toilet and threw up until nothing more could be wrung out of him. Reiki-san had said she would be back to discuss the details of any potential surgery later, since he was currently too busy worshipping the porcelain throne like a drunkard to have any meaningful discussion. Izashi groaned, letting his forehead thunk against the toilet bowl. He'd always hated vomiting. It was disgusting, left him a shaky, sweating mess, and it always went through his nose. Not to mention that it felt like nothing more than a waste of time. He hadn't had much to heave up. He wasn't ill. He'd checked. He couldn't vomit up the rot in Izuku's stomach, no matter how much it felt like it had invaded him, too. He was just being dramatic and wasting time, water, and toilet paper. Izuku needed him. He wasn't Mom. He wasn't the best, far from it. But he was still Dad. He needed to get up. Izashi let the lid fall shut with a bang and flushed one last time. He washed his face and hands and opened the door into the dim room. The light from the bathroom behind him cast a long shadow. It was intimidating. He was intimidating. Izashi stared at the incubator, his fists clenching and unclenching. But he was still Dad. He changed into a clean shirt and fell into his chair. He crossed his arms and propped his head up, watching Izuku. He was asleep. Sleeping was just about the most important thing Izuku could do right now. The last thing Izashi wanted to do was wake him up, but he'd been gone from Izuku's side almost all yesterday. He might as well have abandoned him. Izashi needed to let Izuku know Dad was still there for him. He didn't dare open up the incubator to hold hands or give him a hand hug. That would wake him up. It might be too much right now anyway. And he had just thrown up, better safe than sorry. So he did the only thing he could think of, the only thing he'd ever been good at, that never harmed anyone. He rambled. "You know," he started, careful to keep his voice soft, "I keep calling you Sunshine, Izuku, but you don't know what the sun is, do you?" He huffed a small laugh. "It's quite pretty. I think you'd like it. It's bright and full of life, just like you." His voice cracked. He kept talking. "There's so much for you to see and experience, Izuku. There is much more to the world than your little incubator, you know. Beyond these four walls, beyond the doors of this hospital, there's an entire world out there for you." "Personally, I've always enjoyed the finer things in life," Izashi said with a wry smile. "But then, I've grown so used to what the world has to offer that it seems mundane and, I'll admit, a little boring to me. But for you, everything would be new. Outside, Izuku, the floor is not a blanket or even a pillow like in your little incubator, but something called grass," Izashi said, tracing a finger on the outside of the incubator. He let his fingertip rest above where Izuku's hand was, as if they were holding hands. "It's a bright green plant that spends all of its time growing big and tall, just like you." His voice cracked again. Izashi cleared his throat. "There's also the wind outside, Izuku. It's a little like your CPAP machine, except instead of blowing on your little face, it blows everywhere. Sometimes it's strong, sometimes it's weak, but it always catches you with a strong gust when you're least expecting it," Izashi said, forcing himself to chuckle at the weak joke. "There's so much outside this place that I want to show you, Izuku," Izashi whispered, staring at Izuku's little hand. "Snow in the winter, fallen leaves in autumn, cherry blossoms in the spring. They might be in bloom around your birthday. Then we could have cherry blossom-themed or flavored cake. Oh yes, cake is wonderful, Izuku. Truly one of the finer things in life that I could introduce you to soon. It may be hard to believe, but it's even better than milk, I swear on it." His eyes stung. His voice grew thick. "I could give you anything you want, Izuku. All the food you could ever want to try, all the toys you could ever want to play with, all the clothing you could ever want to wear. You just have to make it to your first birthday. That's all, Izuku. That's all." All right, listeners, this concludes day 39 of All For You. Day 40 will be next. Let me know your all's thoughts and reactions to everything so far, and as always, thank you so much for listening.